this might be unfair, so you can just tell me no, that's okay. But like, what's kind of the elevator pitch that you give when you're, say, at a fair or at a conference where there are people, or maybe there's students and families coming around and they're interested, they're looking for new opportunities. I know we started off, you kind of gave the definition, but if you think about like, how do you sell this idea to someone who's not entirely sure? Like, what's the quick pitch that really opens the door to get those students more interested?
Well, I think it really, one of the things I always start with especially if I'm at a fair and I'm talking to an individual family and I don't have to just pitch a room, is I talk to the student about what they're interested in and what their motivations are for what they're doing after high school. Because a lot of people don't actually know why they're choosing what they're choosing. They're just kind of going with the flow, and they're trying not to swim against the current, to extend that analogy. And so I try to dig a little bit deeper, even if it's a brief conversation, and just ask some probing questions about why they're making the choices they're making, and just kind of try to express the fact that a gap year is the most customizable form of education that you can give yourself, because it really asks the student, what do you like doing? What do you want to learn about yourself? What kind of, let's be real, what skills do you need to be a functioning adult? And what do you want to study once you get to college? And if a student has answers for some or all of those things, they're a good gap year candidate. And I would challenge you to find someone who isn't a good gap year candidate. And I think that's the biggest challenge. There's so many ways to do a gap year right that it's sometimes hard to boil it down to a single sentiment. And that's why I think we have a challenge in communications around gap time, is that people kind of try to pigeonhole it as one thing or another. And really it is more about the qualities of the gap time, that it's formative, that it gets you out of your comfort zone, that it's intentional and meaningful and productive and mentored, the qualities more than the actual actions that you do. And so I don't think I'm actually doing a very good job of giving you that elevator pitch, but I think it's one of the biggest challenges, is that it's hard to boil it down. And so No,
I mean, I think that's fair too, because we've just met here, but you strike me as a person who's good at your job, and a big part of any kind of consulting or advising or tutoring or anything like that. I mean, anything where you're working closely with a person, especially as they're trying to make a big decision about education, career, something like that, is that you have to be very responsive to that person. And so, when I say how do you make that pitch? As I was asking it, I was in my head thinking like, this is unfair, because if you ask me, how would I sell someone on my services for, say, college admissions essays and things like that, I could do it 10 different ways depending on who is standing in front of me. And so what you said is good. And I think, to be fair, you probably really have to be in that conversation and be able to get the answers to some of your questions before you can really proceed with it. That really needs to be like a conversational kind of piece, I would imagine.
Yeah, I think that the quickest pitch that I can give, and this one people kind of give me side eye because they don't believe me, but this is what I say, and I'm 100% serious when I say this. I have come across thousands of people who have taken gap time, because I've worked with hundreds of students, and I meet people at cocktail parties who've taken gap years, and all the other students who I come into contact with through my podcast and other ways of meeting people who've taken gap time. And everyone has told me that it was one of the best decisions they've made and one of the most meaningful years of their life. I've never, ever come across someone who has regretted taking a gap year. And I think that's the only situation I can even think of. You talk to people, 100 people who drive a Lexus, there's going to be one of them who hates that car. And I've never come across anybody who's not thought that their gap year was one of the best years of their life, and not necessarily easy. Not because it was easy, because a gap year is not supposed to be easy, but that it was one of the, it's the thing that made them who they are. And I think that that's a great argument for taking one.
Yeah. And I mean, it makes it an exciting thing, I think, for you to be doing, as your work to help someone to find that experience. As a technical question, and this might be my last technical question for you, but as we're thinking about the number of students who, in the class of 2020, they're already admitted, they have deposits down, or, some schools are changing how they're handling deposits, things like that. I know that I've talked to some students who are considering deferring their admission and maybe doing a gap year or something like that. Each school does it a little bit differently, but in your experience, what's the process that a student goes through to communicate with the university and to try to defer the admission for a year so that they have the opportunity for a gap year? I mean, is it as simple as just calling the admissions office and saying, hey, I want to wait a year? Or is it sometimes more complicated than that, depending on the school?
Yeah, I think that there is usually a process, what we call it a formal deferral process. And most commonly, there's a form on the website. If they're gap year friendly and they have this down to a science, there's usually a form on the website, or they ask you to write a letter of deferral. And in that letter, you would talk about why you want this gap year and what you hope to do with it, and then how it's going to make you maybe a better campus citizen or better student or something like that. And then they would say, okay, we've granted that deferral, and you make sure that your deposit is down at that school. And then they may check in with you throughout the year as well. Some schools have different policies about kind of revisiting what you're doing with your gap time, because they want to make sure that that's useful and productive. But it's not binding. So if you write something in your letter about what you want to do and then coronavirus changes your plans, they won't hold that against you or anything. And in some cases, I'm advising my students to talk about what their, plan B's and C's might be if they can't do what their first choice thing is. But the one thing to note this year is that you should not list coronavirus as the reason you're taking a gap year, even if that's one of the compelling reasons why you're taking a gap year this year. Colleges want to know that you're going to do something with your year, not that just you don't want to go to school right away.
Right. That's great. Yeah. And I know that I've had some students do this, but one was through a very formal sort of organized organization. And he worked for a year, most of a year, in 2 different African countries. Another student who recently did it sort of informally, and she went and lived with family in Korea and worked.
Oh, cool.
And then she went to live with a family friend in China. And then she bounced across like 4 different East Asian countries, and then went on like a series of mini vacations as she made her way home, back across around the world and across the country. And it was incredible. And she had so many cool things to say, but that was when she very much had a structure on her own. But she coordinated that. I believe she's at University of Virginia. One of the other students is at William & Mary. I mean, these are students going to good schools. And so, we know this can be done, but as more students are looking into it, I think making sure that, 1, you have a good plan in place, and then 2, making sure you've communicated that appropriately to your school of choice is going to be very important too, because while the gap year provides you with some cool opportunities, you don't want to maybe lose the other opportunities that you were looking forward to.